Morning, y'all. My name is Paul. I am a pastor at the Appleton location, and I get the privilege of joining you here today to finish up the Counterfeit Kings series. This has been exciting. How many people are like almost to a full set of cards, right? Like you've compiled with your family and friends, and you're trying to figure this out and things. It's been fun. It's been a fun summer series that we've done. I want to recap where we've been. Where we've been has been a journey. I want to talk through how we did this. If you remember, God chose Israel to be his chosen people, to represent himself to the world. And so what God did was he delivered God's people from Egypt, and he led them into the wilderness where God gave them special laws that would set them apart from all the other nations of the world. And then he led them through the wilderness into the promised land, the land that would be their home, and where he would say, this will be your land. I will be your God. You will be my people. And this was great for a while. God led this nation. And then Israel started looking around to the other nations around them and started thinking, well, they got a king, and they got a king, and they got a king. We need a king. And God said, you don't need a king. I am your king. You don't need a king. And he said, if you get a king, here's what they're going to do. They're going to amass a bunch of wealth and chariots, and they're going to tax, and they're going to do all this stuff. You don't need a king. And they said, we do need a king. We need someone to fight for us. And God said, no, I will fight for you. But then God said, you know what, if you want a king, I will give you a king, but here are the rules that a king should follow so that they don't fall into idol worship and worshiping of other gods. And so he gave the kings these rules of things they should follow. And then he gave them Saul as their first king, and then King David, and then Solomon. And these were the kings that were under a unified kingdom of Israel. And then after Solomon, there was a civil war, and the kingdom broke into two nations. The northern kingdom, which was called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. And in Jerusalem, in the southern kingdom, was where the temple was. Now, here's the thing. The kings did exactly what God said they would do. They turned to the right and to the left. They started following other gods from surrounding nations. They started making alliances from other nations. They started having idol worship and worshiping other gods. And so God said, you haven't kept your covenant with me. And so I'm going to bring judgment upon you. So he brought the nation of Assyria into the northern kingdom and wiped them out and scattered them, and then brought Babylon to judge the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's where we're going to pick up today. We're going to pick up the story today with a king named Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin. This is the cartoon picture that's on our card. This is Jehoiachin. Here's a couple things I want you to notice about this guy, okay? This guy, you would have thought I said Jehoiachin, and I said it wrong, because this looks a lot like Jehoiachin, right? Jehoiachin is what a Midwestern person would say this king's name is, right? Like, this is Jehoiachin, my favorite king of Judah. But it's actually Jehoiachin. I looked it up. I said, how would a person who speaks Hebrew say this name? And it was Jehoiachin, which had a lot more throat to it, which is harder to say, which probably means it's right, because it's harder to say. Jehoiachin, I don't know why we ever thought that would be how you'd say that. So Jehoiachin, right? The next thing I want you to notice about Jehoiachin is that there's some people on our team that are affectionately calling him the cotton candy king, which has nothing to do with the Bible. It's just the color scheme that they chose for this. This is why I'm wearing pink today, right? I figured I would match the card that we're talking about, but Jehoiachin. And the last thing I want you to notice about this king is his expression. His expression. Just kind of, if you look at the other kings that we've had, they've been powerful. You could see their muscles, right? You don't see Jehoiachin's muscles. You see him in an expression not of victory, not of strength, not in battle, but kind of this kind of shocked and dazed and confused and kind of like deer caught in the headlights, like, are you kidding me? This is the expression that goes along with the words, are you kidding me? You've probably all made this expression before. You pour yourself a big bowl of cereal, you go to the fridge and realize your kids left you 2 drops of milk, but didn't throw the milk away and say, hey, we need more milk, just left 2 drops of milk. Are you kidding me? Right? This is the expression you've probably made after a long day of work. You come into your home, you sit on the couch, and you realize your phone's in the truck. And you're like, oh, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is what, when you realize that you set your phone alarm to PM instead of AM, right? Oh, are you kidding me? Right? After you get a speeding ticket for only going 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, but the speed limit had just changed, right? Are you kidding me? Right? We've all had these like, are you kidding me expressions. We've all looked like this guy before. Now, our creative arts team did a really good job with this card because I really do feel like this posture of Jehoiachin, this look, this dazed look like a deer caught in the headlights is perfect for Jehoiachin. And so today, if you feel a little bit like this today, or you felt like this in your past, then I want you to listen up. You probably will relate to Jehoiachin. Today, I want to help you understand who Jehoiachin is, why he's significant, and much like many weeks of this series, how Jehoiachin's story leads us to Jesus. Now, before we turn to Scripture to learn about this king, I want to turn to what we call extra-biblical literature and archaeology. Extra-biblical means just outside of the Bible. Is there any notice of this king outside of what we have in the Bible? Yeah, there is. Around the early 1900s, there was this German guy named Robert Koldewey who was leading an excavation near the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. And he found so many artifacts, so many things. But one of the things they found was a series of 300 cuneiform tablets that look like this one. Right? There's just these tablets, and they were chiseled in different language to kind of walk through this. And what they found was that they were administrative documents that they would write down. They were lists of documents. They'd write down who got what. Who got what rations. So there were food rations that were given to important people in Babylon. And you guessed it, Jehoiachin's name shows up on 4 of these tablets. It's recorded as saying, Yahuchinu, king of the land of Yahudu, which scholars are pretty much unified in believing that this is Babylonian for Jehoiachin, king of the land of Judah. So these cuneiform tablets tell us 2 things. Jehoiachin was real. It's not just a story that we have in in ancient texts that have been passed down. This is a real person that lived, and at one point lived in Babylon, and at one point was given food rations. Enough to write it down. No, you're not going to just write down, if I was just living in Babylon, no one's writing down like, hey, Paul got this much oil and barley, right? Like no one's writing that down. So for some reason, Jehoiachin was important. And that's what I want to talk about today. Hopefully you're intrigued a little bit, right? To say, oh my goodness, my goal in that is to say, if we stopped right now, would you go read the story of Jehoiachin to figure that out? I mean, it is so intriguing to say, who was this king and why was he important? So I'm going to read his account in the Bible. It's found in 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 24, if you want to turn there, you can. I'm going to start reading at verse 8. The scripture's also going to be on the screen behind me. It says this, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan, and she was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin prisoner, as the Lord had declared. Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace and cut up the gold articles that King Solomon of Israel had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all of Jerusalem into exile, all of the officers and fighting men and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans. He made Medaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Last week, Pastor Brandon talked about King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, the king who hardened his heart. And this week, we're going to talk about the second to last king of Judah, Jehoiachin. He was 18 years old when he became king. He was only king for 3 months, and in those short 3 months, he did enough to be called doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, which probably meant he continued to allow idol worship and worship of other gods to happen in the land of Judah. See, then Nebuchadnezzar marches down to Jerusalem from Babylon. He surrounds the city, doesn't let any food or water in and out, no materials, no supplies in or out. They're surrounded. And then 18-year-old Jehoiachin with his entourage and his mommy walk out and surrender. Walk out and surrender. And Nebuchadnezzar walks in, pillages the temple, takes the special spiritual artifacts that God told Solomon to make and put in the temple for worship of God, and took them, destroyed them, and took them back to Babylon, along with all the important people, the nobles, the skilled workers, the military, and important people such as Ezekiel was taken back during this time. And they were all exiled into Babylon. They were reunited with Daniel and his friends downstairs in DL. They're learning about Daniel and his friends today. And they took them and they were reunited back up in Babylon because Daniel and his friends were taken at an earlier siege of Jerusalem. And then he left behind only the poor and unimportant and left Zedekiah as king in service to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Now, if you look at this tactic that Jehoiachin has, is different than almost all the other kings of Israel and Judah. All the other kings of Israel and Judah, when surrounded, they would have fought. They would have fought until it was utter defeat. They would have stood up and said, "We are Israel. We are Judah. We are going to fight." And even those that lost got to a point, they fought until they knew it was over. And then they would make a deal and say, "Hey, if you spare us, we will pay taxes to you. We will pay loyalty to you." But not Jehoiachin. He just walks out with his entourage and his mom and says, "I'm done. I'm done. I've been on the job 3 months. I'm done. I'm done." Now, the Bible doesn't say that this was wise or noble. The Bible doesn't say good job, doesn't say this was a good thing, but we can see that this tactic, this surrender, may have saved his life. May have saved his life. Now, meanwhile, he's in prison in Babylon, and back in Jerusalem, Zedekiah is obedient for 3 years, and then he rebels against Babylon, and Babylon came back, and then finally completely destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And that's how the scroll of 2 Kings ends, is with the utter destruction and judgment of Jerusalem. Now, if you were Jewish, you would look at this and say, this is rock bottom. We are at the bottom. If we can't get any worse than this. Now, 1st and 2nd Kings is written while they're in Babylon in exile. They looked back and said, we need to write down how we got here. And so they look back and say, how did we get here? Well, this king did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and this king did good in the eyes of the Lord, and this king did evil, and all of our rebellion it led us to destruction and God's coming judgment. See, Jeremiah is a book in our scriptures that was written about the same events, but it was written in real time. Jeremiah is not in Babylon looking back and writing down what happened. He's writing it down as it happens. Jeremiah and the book of Kings have very similar stories of destruction. And so after the exile, if maybe in Jesus' time, if you were a kid going to synagogue with your family, and in the corner of the synagogue is a table full of scrolls, and every week they're going to read a special passage of their holy scriptures. And they're thinking, okay, we could get creation, we could get Moses, we could get Joshua, we could get some really cool stories, we could get some kind of cool poems. I mean, as a teenager, you're like, maybe Song of Solomon, I don't know, maybe that'll come out, Like, you just get to a spot of what could you choose? What you don't want them to choose is Jeremiah and Kings. Who wants to hear about how horrible we were? How horrible our ancestors were in rebellion against God? Who wants to hear that? It was rock bottom. But here's the thing, the story ends with the destruction of Jerusalem, but both 2 Kings and Jeremiah, the last 3 verses, is kind of like an epilogue to the story. You know how you finish a book and then, last chapter, and then there's an epilogue, which is like, 37 years later. Maybe you're watching a movie and the movie ends and you're like, I want to know what happens to those characters. And then it's like 10 years later and they're married and they're all living happily ever after, right? The last 3 verses of the book of 2 Kings and Jeremiah are identical, which, yes, means one of them took it from the other, right? And you can figure out what scholars say about who took it. But either way, they wanted to end this story the same way. And it is a 37 years later type of epilogue. I'm going to read these verses. I'm going to read them out of 2 Kings. If you want to turn to Jeremiah and Jeremiah, they're exactly the same. It says this, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin. So 37 years later, the epilogue. 37 years later, the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year Marduk became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. The end. It doesn't say the end, I just added that. But here's the thing. The writers of Kings and the writer of Jeremiah, which are different writers, but one stole from the other, whatever, wanted this to be the ending of this story. Wanted this to be how the story ends. Wanted this to be how they thought of this judgment and rebellion. They wanted this story in here. Why did it make the cut? Why was this in here? Right? 37 years. Jehoiachin's 55 years old. Nebuchadnezzar dies and Jehoiachin is released from prison and given a seat of honor and is given regular allowance and rations as long as he lived. Do you realize how significant these tablets that were found in Iraq are? It would have been one thing to just have seen a biblical king's name. That, hey, this guy existed. That would have been so great. But it even goes as far as to say that Jehoiachin received rations of oil and barley and spices. One of the tablets even says Jehoiachin was given 10 selah of oil. Now, a selah is a measurement. I don't know what it is. Look it up. I don't care. But what we do know is this was a higher amount than the other listed people on these tablets, which proves that Jehoiachin was given a place of honor just like Scripture says. Now, one more observation that I want to make is that both Scripture and this tablet called Jehoiachin, king of Judah, meaning he was still recognized as king of Judah. He was not the last king of Judah, that was Zedekiah, but he was the last living king of Judah, and that is hugely significant. The royal line of David was still alive. So what does this mean for us? This is a great archaeological and biblical story. Cool, Paul. What does this mean for us? Well, have you ever felt like Jehoiachin, frozen, confused, like this? Have you ever been like that? You know, from birth to 7 years old, Jehoiachin lived under the kingdom of his grandpa, King Josiah, who did right in the eyes of God. And then as a 7-year-old, his grandpa king died. And his dad took over the kingdom, Jehoiakim, who did evil in the eyes of God. So from 7 to 18, he's living under a corrupt, evil kingdom. And then as 18, his dad dies, who's also the king. And immediately, Nebuchadnezzar is on his door, not for his rebellion, but for his dad's rebellion. Now, I'm not saying in those 3 months he was a good king. He was evil in the eyes of the Lord. But can you imagine the cards that he was dealt? Grandpa and king dies at 7. Your dad then, his dad dies at 18. And already Nebuchadnezzar's on the way. You know, he's been there 3 months. Nebuchadnezzar's already on the way to come against his dad. And he shows up, and there's a knock on the door from Nebuchadnezzar, and he's in his spot. He's like, what? I just got this job. I just lost my dad. What? What am I supposed to do with that? When I hear this story, I think about a 14-year-old refugee boy that I met in Clarkston, Georgia when I was a missionary there. And I don't know the exact circumstances of how he got resettled to the United States, but I'm sure it was because there was war and terrorism in his country. And I'm sure they just packed up anything that they could carry, maybe lost family members, maybe left people behind, left a lot of stuff, walked to a neighboring country, settled into a refugee camp. He was probably raised in a refugee camp. And then he was resettled to Clarkston, Georgia, just outside of eastern Atlanta. The Refugee Resettlement Agency found them an apartment, found his mom and his older adult brother jobs, and got him enrolled in school and said, good luck. And those are some heavy cards to be dealt. And I remember when I met him, first time I met his family, I brought him home from the ministry event that we were doing. He said, you have to come talk to my mom because she doesn't know where I was and doesn't believe I was at this ministry program thing. So you have to come talk to my mom. And I walk in to this house, this apartment that has no AC. It's hot. It's Atlanta in the summer. And I'm standing in this kitchen, and this mom is screaming at this 14-year-old boy in a language I don't understand. I don't know what she was saying, and I try to step in, but she doesn't understand what I'm saying. And he and his family were dealt a rough hand of cards. What were they to do? So what did I do? I left, and then he left home. He couldn't stay there anymore. He was living on the streets, and we've got him food, and we got him a temporary housing, which didn't last long. And there was another time I was called, and I picked him up from a 3-night stay in the hospital because his older brother had beaten him. And I called CPS multiple times and wanted to get him help. And at some point, I had to let go because he left his family and joined a new family, which was a gang, who had him running guns and transporting guns. And that's when we had to kind of separate a little bit. And this was just the cards he was dealt. It's like Jehoiachin showing up, 18-year-old boy, Nebuchadnezzar knocking on the door with this expression. And this 14-year-old boy, I've had conversations with him about Jesus, and I had conversations with him, and he said, but why am I going through this? Why is God having me go through this? Why is God allowing me to go through this? And I had no good answers. I had biblical answers, but I had no good answers to tell him. And he felt like Jehoiachin. And maybe you feel like Jehoiachin. Maybe there are things out of your control where you're left feeling shocked and confused, asking God, why? Are you kidding me? Maybe it was a health diagnosis. Maybe it's mass layoff from your company. Maybe it's losing a child. Maybe as a child you experienced neglect and abuse and violence, and maybe you're introduced to substance abuse and pornography use at an early age, and then you can probably relate with Jehoiachin, where you just did what you felt. You played the cards you had. You did what you felt was right, but now you were frozen and stuck, and maybe you're still frozen and stuck. You know, none of us are in that situation. But if you're in that place right now of frozen and stuck for whatever reason, I want you to know that God sees you. And God is working where you cannot see. God sees you, and he's working where you cannot see. See, Jehoiachin didn't choose to become a king and lead a rebellion against God. He inherited a mess, and he deserved to be killed like all the other kings before him. But God spared him. God showed him mercy, and it definitely had nothing to do with him. He did evil in God's eyes, but God still showed him mercy and spared his life. Fast forward 37 years, he's been in prison, and all of a sudden there's a knock at the prison cell and says, hey, take your prison clothes, leave them behind, and come sit at the king's table. And this is the expression again. Are you kidding? God, are you kidding me? I didn't do anything to deserve that. You know, his story of Jehoiachin, out of no work of his own, being elevated to a place of honor in Babylon, makes me think of other stories of other refugee boys that I met who ended up in Clarkston the same way. War and terrorism and unrest in their country, and they left it all and lost family members and things, and were resettled into a new country, and just were enrolled in the local middle school where they don't really know the language and don't really know the culture. But they met this young adult who's a Christian who said, hey, I want to show you the best that America has to offer. And he took them out to the small group of boys, took them out to get root beer floats, get a hot dog, go to a movie, go camping, and they read the Bible and learned about Jesus. And they gave their lives to Jesus, and they were baptized, and they started telling their younger siblings about Jesus. And at some point, they look around Clarkston. There's kids from all over the world. And they look around and say, God, why us? Why are we so fortunate to have met Jesus? Why us? Nothing that we did, but why us? And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe God restored or redeemed your past only through his grace and love. Maybe you had unexpected life circumstances that were advantageous for you, that were good for you. Where maybe you didn't always see it as a blessing. Maybe you see it as a blessing now from God. Maybe just the fact that you are in this room right now is God's grace and his love for you that you don't even deserve. Just like Jehoiachin, you're sitting here asking God, are you kidding me? This is my life. This is what you have given me, and it is so good. I'm going to tell you the same thing I told those with a different story. God sees you, and he's still working where you cannot see. And like Jehoiachin, we have to submit to God's sovereignty, his control. He is the King of kings, the Lord of lords, the one who's sovereign over all. Job says it this way. Job was also had to submit to God's sovereignty. He had some bad things happen in his life and some good things happen in his life. And this is what he says. Job 1:21 says this, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, I'm not asking you to be able to admit this or say this out loud based on what you're going through or what you have gone through. But I think about the posture that Job has, open-handed to God and saying, God, I'm living my life so open to you that you can put anything in my hands and you can take anything out of my hands. You are sovereign, you are Lord, you are King. And so I live my life open to you. And yeah, you might put a blessing in my hand, but you might take something from me as well. Now here's the thing about this analogy that nobody tells you. If you live your life close-fisted to the sovereignty of God, it changes nothing. God can still take something out of your hand and still put something in your hands. We have to submit to his sovereignty. There's no bargaining. There's no amount of, well, my will says I want this. God is still in control. Isaiah says it this way, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts. And if you're standing here with this picture on your face, this look on your face, then God has probably shocked you with his ways and his thoughts that are higher than yours. Now, Jehoiachin never got the answer to why his life turned out the way that it did. He just lived the rest of his years eating at the king's table, getting special rations and a seat of honor. He never understood why, but we know why. We're given the reason why. We're given why we even have this story in the Bible. Because Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his name shows up once in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 1 is the genealogy of Jesus, the royal line of David, which goes back and it just captures generation after generation from Abraham to David, and then David to Joseph, and then to Jesus. And in verse 9, 10, or 9 through 12, it says this. And they're just names. Ammon, the father of Josiah, and Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel, and then it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And in my Bible, after the name Jeconiah, there's a little C. There's a superscript C there. And if I go down to my footnote where it says C, it says, that is Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin was a part of the royal line of David, and had God not spared his life, the Messiah would not have come from the line of David. The Messiah, the future king, King Israel's forever king, our King of Kings, was prophesied to come from the royal line of David. So that means God is working in the bad things in your life. God is working when you don't see him working. And in the positive blessings in your life, God's working where you may not see and you may never see, but you live your life surrendered to him. Now, here's what I want to do today. I want to end with just a little bit of reflection. This might feel uncomfortable for you, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I ask you, if you would feel comfortable, just close your eyes and just reflect with me. Where has God, out of no prompting of your own, brought something into your life that was hard, that was devastating, that nearly destroyed you? These areas might be too shameful that you would even share them with other people. Hold those moments before God with open hands. What would you want to say to God about those moments? What do you think God wants to say to you about those moments? God sees you. and is working where you cannot see. Now I want you to think about where God, out of no prompting of your own, brought something into your life that was a miraculous show of love and grace. Maybe these are even areas that you've claimed credit for in the past, but now you know it's from God. Hold these moments before God with open hands. What would you want to say to God about those moments? What do you think God would want to say to you about those moments? God sees you and is working where you cannot see. I don't know where you're at today, but if you're confused by God's sovereignty, I want to say this: God is in control. God's ways are higher than your ways. His thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And you may not know today why you're going through what you're going through. But God may show you someday. But that day might not be today. God brought restoration out of Jehoiachin's life that led to Jesus, our King of Kings. Jesus is someone worth trusting. He's someone worth worshiping, not because his plans make sense, but because his plans are good, even if we don't know how or why just yet. Would you stand, if you're able, for the closing prayer and benediction? We trust in you, Lord, with all our hearts. We no longer lean on our own understanding. In all our ways, we acknowledge you, and we trust you to make our paths straight. Amen. And this is our benediction today from Romans chapter 11, 33 through 36. It says, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay them? For from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." See you next week.